Hello, everyone. This is Joy Allen. I am the Customer Success Manager for NetApp and am located out of the Detroit, Michigan office. I have with me today Miles Kniep. I'm very happy to have him and to have him talk to you about OCI's Business Entities and Annotations today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Miles.
Cool. Thank you, Joy. So some of you may remember me. I'm Miles Kniep. I'm a Customer Success Manager based in Amsterdam. I've been with NetApp for about 5.5 years now. Generally aligned to the OnCommand Insight product, but I've dabbled in Waffle and NFS and myriad of other things. So we may have had some interactions in the past on that sort of thing. I guess to begin with, we'll walk through the fundamentals of annotations and business entities. So you can't really expect this to be a deep dive into the specifics of one or the other. We're not going to go super deep into the REST API or anything, but my hope is that you walk away today with a pretty good understanding of when to use an annotation, when to use business entities, and kind of how you can leverage both to extract the most value on both the asset or the application basis within OCI. So with that, just high-level agenda, we'll talk about annotations. What are they? Why they're valuable? How do we set yourself up to extract that value? And then the same for business entities. We'll walk through a brief demo. I'd love to get some Q&A going in that. So if people have questions, put into the chat, unmute yourself or something, whatever is fine. And similarly, I don't think we'll take a full hour for this, so we can also have some time for discussion. So fundamentally, annotation, if you were to look it up in the dictionary, is a note by way of explanation or comment added to text or a diagram. And what that really means is it's just a label you're putting onto a box or a thing. So if you're thinking like going to the grocery store or something, that's the label that says the number of calories, the how many grams of something, the ingredients that went into it. These are all things that help you understand what that thing is, what value it may provide, that maybe wouldn't have been there, natively. So some of the characteristics of an annotation, firstly, is that they can be many different types. They can be free text. They can be a Boolean value. You could also apply dates, so things like the go live date, the sunset date, the end of support date for physical hardware, for example. A specific number or a list of predefined values, maybe a list of data centers or something like that. You can also create rules to automatically assign these things based on query results. That can be especially helpful in medium to large size environments where, pulling things out of your CMDB manually and going and manually updating those annotations can be a bit of a hassle. And the real benefit of annotations, though, is that you can tailor those to your business process and requirements. Not everybody cares about the sunset date for something physical, but that maybe you care specifically about, from a performance perspective, what things are hot so you're not always getting notifications on them. Or maybe specifically what environment something sits in. And so you can create custom annotations that help you accomplish those things. In addition, annotations have one key benefit is that in a dashboard context, if you were to apply a filter on the dashboard level, it will come up as a dropdown rather than just being a free text search, which is kind of an advantage you would get over business entities. And then lastly, especially for those of you using the perform component of OCI, you can limit your performance policies by a annotation, whether it matches or not. And so that can be really helpful if you're defining by environment, for example, and you don't want to get notification on the lab or the development environment, that sort of thing. Some of the limitations, though, are going to be that you can't assign annotation to an application, but that's going to be intentional because if you think about that, looking at an app, that's going to contain, I think we did a session on applications in the past. If not, somebody put into the chat and I can cover those in a moment. But an application is going to consist of physical storage that could be distributed, virtual compute and physical compute that's also probably distributed. And because of that, if you assign the label Data Center Tokyo, what if it's not all in Tokyo? So that can be a little bit deceiving. And because of that, it doesn't really make sense to apply an annotation there. And you can't really use them to build a hierarchy. So coming back to the fact that it's a label, you can't say grams are a subset of calories on, a food label, right? But what you can do with that is with a business entity. So you can say that a specific set of brands belongs to a certain retailer, and that retailer sells those brands in these markets, that sort of thing. And that's where business entities will come into play. So talking about why annotations can be valuable, oftentimes I see in many environments, this sort of information isn't readily available. So when you're talking about the physical location of an asset, for example, a node, you can put in what data center it sits in, the building, the floor, the rack, the city, the country, all of those things. You don't have to, but when you're tracking lots and lots of hardware, that can be extremely, extremely beneficial. And similarly, you can report on the asset age. That helps you understand and forecast when things are going to be EOL'd and then retired, and then so how quickly do you need to migrate off of that hardware? Similarly, if something's legacy and you don't want that part of a set of reports because they're not part of the core production applications or something, you can easily exclude by putting in a legacy flag, which, by the way, that's not in the box in OCI. That's the beauty of custom annotations. And specifically with tiers and service levels, you can put in a cost association per gigabyte. And so the benefit there is when you're looking at, we'll just say a storage pool that's considered tier 1, that runs a price of $10 per gigabyte. And then you have a huge set of volumes on top of that have a set price for the service levels, for example, whether they include mirroring or not. You can deduce, how much it costs to operate based on the tier because of the pool, but also how much it's going to cost to the end user based on the service level, based on the services you're providing with that volume. And I think I already covered this last bit, but you can easily flag based on, any value that is beneficial to you. Show of hands, though, virtually at least. Has anybody come up with any interesting or what they would consider to be unique ways of using annotations in OCI? I've seen a few novel ways or specific process type of things that some have used, but I'd be interested to hear, and maybe we can discuss that towards the end. So if you have input, put it in the chat.
Also, Miles, I just want to call out, I hear some background noise, and it looks like I have everyone muted, so I'm not really sure how to mute that. But if you could, looks like maybe it stopped now. Thank you.
Yeah, it could be because I muted myself. Give me 1 second. I'll check on that. It was fine earlier, though.
Okay, now we can't hear you, Miles. Don't mute yourself.
Yep, sorry about that. I was just checking to see what was going on there. So, moving to business entities. I guess first off, does anybody have questions about annotations? At a fundamental level, does that make sense to everyone? Okay, I guess that's good. So coming to the business entity, what you're really looking at is a framework of your business structure. And so you're mapping an asset to a business consumer. If you're a service provider, we're talking about a customer. If we're talking, like, say, strictly within NetApp, we would be mapping this to, maybe at the hardware level, we'd be mapping it to some entity within IT, but then at the volume and the VM level, we're talking about who owns an application. So who's the one absorbing the cost on that? So coming to some of the core characteristics, thanks, Joy, for the note there. I'll check that in a second. Some of the characteristics is that a business entity can be assigned to just about any type of asset. There are a few limitations, for example, storage pools. Reason for that being that that's natively a shared asset. However, the node is going to be part of the storage, which can be associated to a business entity. And then all the child objects, of course, can be. But the key that I think most people should do, and most people do leverage, is assigning a business entity to an application. And what that will do is, in OCI, you will see that all objects underneath there have a derived value of that business entity. And if that is a shared resource that is in multiple applications that are in different business entities, you will also find that it will just say that there are multiple. But this helps you start to understand, which volumes are serving which applications, are serving which business functions. So when it comes to understanding business impact in something like a outage or a performance incident, you understand that, but also coming from a costing perspective, you know who's consuming what, right? So you have a benefit on both sides there. And the big difference is, looking at the annotation, it's almost, if you're familiar with database, it's like adding a column in a table or even in Excel, for example. Whereas with a business entity, it's like adding a whole dimension table that we're referencing. And so because of that, coming over to the data warehouse side of things, you can get quite a bit more complex with it. It's also pretty easy to do filtering on dashboard widgets. However, one limitation there is that you must use free text for the dashboard as a whole. So you don't get necessarily a dropdown, though when we get to the UI, I think you may see and understand why that is the case. A few, I guess, limitations, though, are going to be that it's not automated. You can't assign business entities like you do with annotation rules. Maybe one day this will change, I'm not sure. But at the moment, I think it's kind of a good thing because you really should be looking at what belongs to the application first. And anything under that umbrella is what should be allocated to the business entity. If you go set a rule and accidentally, assign a set of volumes to the wrong business entity, and then you're using that for chargeback, that could be a little bit problematic. Or if you're looking at pushing that into CMDB or something, you're going to have the same kind of problem. And then you can't really use on performance policies, but those were made specifically in mind for usage with annotations. So with business entities, since it's not so ad hoc, you need to keep in mind a few things when populating all of that into OCI. So the first thing you should really do is look at what's your corporate hierarchy. Look at what departments you have, what business units, that sort of thing. If you can get visibility into it, maybe even some of the core projects or functions that those units provide. Because then once you push this into OCI, you have that same level of visibility across the whole infrastructure. So I'll kind of walk through an example here that I did as a, I guess you would say, practice run for looking at NetApp, which we have all kinds of organizations, so we'll have a bit of variety. And then you'll need to come up with a standard sort of naming convention. So if it's a business unit that has 8 words in the title, that should probably come down to something that's easy to reference and understand, both in its search terms, but also in the report. And then lastly, you'll need to start to understand what core applications, let alone looking at all the other random tools, but what core applications do they consume that you need to provide visibility into? And then it's as simple as assigning those resources. And I specifically call out assigning compute resources because that's all it takes. OCI then does the mapping for you and understands what volumes, internal volumes, pools, nodes, ports, all of that. It understands the full stack then. So I'll show that here in a second. Any questions so far? Question from Nicholas. If you have a node, you want to show it in a storage array. Sorry, could you expand on that for me?
Yeah, I mean, if you have, I don't understand not using hierarchies. What ends up happening is if I have a data center, I have a storage array in it, right? I want to show at every single level that annotation. But what's happened now is I now have to annotate at every single level because there's no interaction between the hierarchy, right? So if it's in a data center, I have to show the storage is in that data center, the node is in that data center, and the volumes are in the data center. That's 3 different annotations I have to make. Why not just make them inherent?
Yeah. So you mean a rule that could basically apply all the way down the chain? Yeah. Okay. So I think I understand that could be, yeah, that would be problematic, especially as you start looking really broad, right? Especially multiple data centers. So I think 2 things. One, I think OCI historically really has a focus on, well, and even modern unified manager really is looking at the asset type, not necessarily the hierarchy. For comparison, maybe with something like DFM. So 2 things. One, we can flesh that out and talk to engineering about it. So I'll follow up with you offline just to see if maybe there's a reason why that's not been done. Because on the other end of things, in the physical, that's definitely good. But then in the logical end of things, if you were to do that on, say, an annotation that says environment dev, and you put that in the, let's just say, on the pool, what if, dev is then split out into QA and production engineering, right? Well, then you have every single volume under that pool, allocated to it. So I guess the other key is that comes back to also annotation rule precedence. But between the 2, 1, talking to engineering, and 2, keeping in mind precedence and how that would work in the ideal world, I'm sure that we can come up with something. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, cool. Thanks for that. Also, a question from Jonathan. Essentially, hosting provider with multiple customers, how would you map applications, business entities, and annotations to that kind of structure? Sorry, do you mean what I have up on screen or something different? You can unmute yourself if you want. All right, no worries. I will take a shot in the dark here. So I believe what you could be talking about is applications that might belong to a specific tenant or annotations that might be specific to a specific tenant. So what I think you're talking about is multi-tenancy ruling. I think that can get pretty complex though. So generally what could make more sense is to define the business entity and then use that as one of the query criteria for the annotation rule. I guess if you have more questions on that, let me know in the chat and we can discuss after. So continuing with what I have on screen here, this is just a very high level, all the things I could think of within NetApp that I've had interaction with. And obviously there are many, many other things, many different product groups, other orgs I didn't even get to. But the key is I want to distill out a few core things here, right? So putting it into a chart, I did this on paper first, you might wind up with something like this. So you have the tenant up top as NetApp, or if you're not functioning as a service provider, you could just leave that as NA. you'll have a few core lines of business. So in this case, I said product operations, so that being the development groups, field operations, and then the sales teams. And then obviously there will be others like services and whatnot. Under that, you would have a business unit. And so here I have Data Fabric Manageability Group, DFMG for short, because otherwise that's way too many characters. And MPG, whose total name I can't remember now, because I've always called them MPG as long as I can remember. So looking at that, I have a little bit of visibility, and I know some of the projects or core focuses they deal with, right? And so this is one example of how things could look like. And one difference you might see here is on the left with product operations, the projects I'm using are like the projects they're developing, right? But on the right, you see these are more the components that they're consuming or relying on. So maybe we have a sales operations team that runs the CRM, that sort of thing. And then from there, the next thing we might have to look at is what specific applications do those groups rely on. So within DFMG, or actually above that, product operations, they may have a homegrown tool that they've named Earl.netapp.com or something, which by the way doesn't exist, but let's say they do. And then under the OnCommand Insight engineering team, they probably have something that simulates data sources, because we really wouldn't want to, keep tons and tons and tons of storage of every kind and hypervisor of every kind and all of that running in lab nonstop, right? And then you have some other things in field operations and over in sales and that sort of thing. So I have all of that at least understood on paper. And then from there, what I will need to do is create a query to find those things. And then basically just flag them to the application. If you haven't created the application, I'll show that here in a moment, just on screen. Oh, okay, perfect, Jonathan. Yep. That's exactly what I was talking about. So Jonathan's question earlier was essentially, as a hosting provider with many customers, how would you map those? And the fundamental here is that you can designate multiple tenants. This is just my one example using the company I work for. Right, but I could easily add, all of you guys if you were all hosted on NetApp, right? In the Amsterdam office, no less. So once this is all done, a few core things come out. First is you'll find the assets down the stack are all mapped to the business entity, or if they have multiple, you'll see that as well. And you also will have a better picture of what critical applications belong to who, what they are depending on. And so you can much more easily address and mitigate fires, especially if you're using anomaly detection. I'm sure that's something we have covered before, but we should probably do again because it's extremely useful. But essentially with anomaly detection, you are able to statistically learn what is normal for that set of assets. And if something goes outside of that, OCI will flag it for you. And the benefit is you're not waiting for latency to spike. You may see that there's a new job that runs nightly. Well, was that expected? Did we size for that? That's the kind of questions you can start asking because you didn't have to wait for latency to jump. So I guess if there are any questions or inputs before I kind of go onto the screen here, please go ahead. Okay. So I guess I'll sign in here. Yes, my licenses will expire. Okay. So I think before I go into the app, let's just show the business entity here. If you just go to manage, by the way, I'm running 733 on this. Though most of the 7.3 family should look like this. So business entities in this demo database, we have multiple tenants actually. So we see a make-believe tenant called Concord International Airways, another one called Global Appliance Distributors, HybridSoft, and NetApp. So let's just filter this down. And here I can see the different entities within NetApp. Product operations as my line of business, the different units underneath there, and the different projects. And then same for each. And you don't have to use all of these again, right? So you could say a line of business in A on a business unit, and then something down in project. It's totally suitable to whatever works for you. So there's an example right there. So I guess coming back to applications, let's go look at ERP. This one I thought to be quite interesting. So here we can see that it's labeled as high priority. We can see the business entity associated. I can easily go change this if I want to, since I'm logged in as an administrator. There we go. I can see all of the resources within the application: compute, hypervisors, ports, volumes, etc. And if anything's associated to latency on the app, that shows up here. You guys have probably seen some of this before. So I think the more important bit is let's click on this anomalous compute resource. And the first thing we see here is just the regular normal assets we collect from the hypervisor. But you can see here, it's associated to two applications, ERP and also Exchange 2016. And so similarly, you can see two business entities rely on this compute resource: HybridSoft and NetApp Management Software SAP. So as a compute resource, I would already be maybe a little concerned about that, though I suppose it depends on what I'm doing. And I guess coming back, we should see something very similar down at the storage level. Let's go with that anomalous internal volume. Yep, similar here, we can see that's shared. And there's actually a really good example. We can see the service level is gold, and the tier is gold fast. And you can see it's been derived from a parent object. So that came from the storage pool, possibly the array itself. Whereas the service level we can see has been assigned directly based on some annotation rule we have. So that's how it looks like just on the asset landing page. I guess another thing, I'm going to show you the REST API here really quickly. This is just the virtual machine I queried earlier. You can similarly see here your basics of the virtual machine, the capacity. I put an expand in here for applications and annotations. And you can simply see here, well, we didn't annotate the VM itself, right? But we can see the ERP it's assigned to, and we can see the tenant business unit project it belongs to, and same with the other one. So if you're doing any programmatic access, it's very easy to pull that out on the asset level as well. So coming over to annotations, there are quite a few already built into OCI. I think all of these are default except for maybe one. Lots of customers of ours will pump some of this over from CMDB because it's something very closely associated with like time of install. So it's already there, but some of the other things are much easier to deduce programmatically with an annotation rule. So while floor and rack might be difficult, something like service level or data center might be easy to do just based on what it belongs to, right? Or the naming convention, that sort of thing. So coming to how to annotate. I guess the first thing here, I already created, nope, somebody deleted it. Well, let's just use hot. Hot is our annotation of the day, and we can see it's a Boolean value for overutilized devices. So traditionally, I presume you could use this to make a report of hardware that's being pushed to the limit that you maybe need to look at expanding on. But another way of doing it is you don't want to be consistently notified about this being noisy because of high latency. If you're waiting on an order, there's not much you can do about it, right? So what you could do here is go and annotate something. What we would do is either go to the asset directly, or I could go make a query. So I have a storage pool, and if it has a total utilization of more than 85% average over the course of 7 days, which we only have one out of many. Let me just clear that out so you guys can see. Huge list. Really, really, really big list. I don't want to get notified on it because I've probably already gotten some warnings on that already. So we'll do that. We will save. We would then go to Manage Annotation Rules. And here we already have a whole bunch of things for tiers, service levels. There's our service level gold. We can go investigate that in a moment. And when I was experimenting a few days ago, I actually went and added this already. So let me just delete it though. What we'll do is we'll just say hot pools. We'll choose a query. Hot pools, 7 days. Annotation of hot. And we will say yes. And we'll save. And then I'll run my rules. Just because I'm demonstrating this now. So from there, what we would need to do, if I don't want to get notifications on that, that was on a storage pool. Let's go to a performance policy. There's our nodes, our volumes. Probably should have something for a pool, shouldn't I? Storage, pool, latency. With annotation hot is no. So everything except the ones that are already labeled hot. And yeah, first occurrence, warning. Let's say utilization greater than 75%. So you can see the difference here. I put an annotation rule of anything that's been 80% or more for more than 7 days. So this will kind of help me understand the first instance when a pool becomes at risk, so to speak, of impacting whatever workload I'm running there. So then I just save that, and that's that. So we've talked about bulk annotating using queries. I guess another way we could do that, though, if you don't want to make a rule, you can simply come up with a name or set of criteria. I could say business entities and say net app. And then I could simply select here, add an annotation or remove, add an application or remove, add a business entity or remove, or any subset for that matter. I guess any questions so far? Anything you would like to see or discuss? Andy, very good point. Coming back over to, so Andy asks, I think you all can see in the chat, why are business entities search free text and not drop down? I think that really comes back to how they display in the UI, right? So here it's a nice, table sort of format. But when we go over to an application or something, Let's go back to ERP since that was our example case. Let's look at how that shows up. It doesn't only say NetApp, right? It says netapp.sales.managementsoftware.sap. So if I come to a dashboard, this is something I was working on with somebody a little while ago. Just wait on that to load. If I were to type in here, I would just get this huge list, which you can actually see right here. That's a little difficult to navigate considering the dots or the slashes, right? So what's easier is just to type NetApp, right? Or I could say, NetApp dot something. So I think that's part of it. The other is, we could talk to engineering about that, but frankly, I think that becomes more of an issue for usability than just having free text. Whereas with an annotation, it's normally a limited set of results. It's like a list. So for example, with tier, you would have something like this, right? It's only a few, and they're all simple. It's not a big, long string. Jim asked, can we increase number of rows seen in a window? You mean over on the queries? Is that right? Let's see. So would you want it to be smaller? Is that what you mean? So it's like smaller text? Okay, so like no blank space here, essentially. Is that right? Okay. Yeah, I'm not so sure about that. I guess what we could look at is having a change in size of this query results window. So it's not quite so padded top to bottom. That would probably make sense. Again, it may just make the interface look really clunky. Yeah, let's talk about that offline. Thanks. Jim for row count. Sorry, making notes, guys. Any other inputs? Otherwise, I think we're about done. But I'm totally open to questions, anything you would like to see demonstrated. I guess the only thing I will say is I don't have a data warehouse to demonstrate with. And also in my lab system, the data warehouse, when you're just making a report on the fly, is relatively slow. So it would be a fairly boring process, I think. I guess with that then, if no questions, there are a few resources I would recommend reviewing. These are all in the OCI 7.3x help guide, written by our masterful friends over in engineering. They have a whole segment on preparing assets for annotation, finding them with queries, and analyzing your corporate structure. So Joy will be sending out these slides after the call, and you can review. Otherwise, by all means, feel free to reach out to me.
Thank you so much, Miles.
Question.
Thank you. And I'll just stall here for a moment in case there's someone that would like to take themselves off mute and ask a question or type something in the chat window. But as Miles said, I will be sending out the deck and the recording afterwards to all those that registered. And I would like to just thank you for your time. And if you have any feedback, good or bad, we'd like to hear that. So you know how to reach me and Miles. Please feel free to reach out, and we will follow up with the one-off questions after the call. Thank you again very much. Have a great day.
Thanks, Joy. I guess circling back, Jim asked to demo how to do a dashboard widget using an entity. So let's just go edit this guy. So I have something here, application VM latency. We would simply go make a new one or edit. And what we've done is added filter by statements here. So let me just delete these. Not sure why that keeps popping up. And we would just set business entity. And the key is you don't want to leave this at any. you want to go select the variable you defined at the top of the dashboard. So in this case, business entity. And then similarly for application. And I do find to keep this more, I guess you could say, tightly scoped, what can help is also to add something like priority. Not leave it as a variable, but just say you only want the critical, high, and medium ones. Because maybe you have dozens of low priority applications, but that's not the focus of executing on that particular dashboard, which I've covered that sort of thing in previous sessions. So then it would look something like that. Does that answer your question, Jim? Cool. And Andy, by all means, reach out to me. I'll shoot you an email after.
Okay, and I'm going to end the recording now. Thank you, and have a great day.
Thank you.